This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The
nefarious,
significant and protracted
political
theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. Well, welcome back to Political Theater. We are in the first week of Donald Trump's second term in office. It started off on Monday with his inauguration. And towards the end of the Biden presidency, which ended at 11:59 a.m. on Monday, January 20th, we got news of several pardons that the outgoing president had made. And throughout the day, as soon as Donald Trump took office, we were anticipating a lot of executive actions, a lot of executive orders. And then towards the end of the night, we got his first round of pardons. So we're going to talk a little bit about presidential pardons, about what happened this week with both Biden and Trump, how it fits into an historic context, what exactly is the power to pardon, and who better than to talk this over than Todd Ruger, our legal affairs editor here at CQ Roll Call, and a frequent guest and friend of Political Theater. Todd, welcome back to Political Theater.
Thank you, Jason. Always good to be here. Always love the topics that you pick.
Yes, I think we to let people in on the magic of how these podcasts are formed. I went down for what was the last bagel available that somebody had left behind in the kitchen in our newsroom, because I had a headline, but not the guts, if you will, of the podcast, which was just simply "Pardon me, pardon you," and then I thought of like Oprah, like handing out pardons, like you get a pardon and you get a pardon and you get a pardon, and it seemed to fit. Let's go real quickly what we did see. Towards the end of every presidency, we do tend to see an uptick in the number of pardons that a president does. Real quickly, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution provides the president the ability to pardon, and it's fairly comprehensive. And by pardon, we mean wiping out a criminal record or convictions for offenses against the United States. This is not civil cases or state cases. Which means people get out of prison, their records are cleaned. There's also commutations where just simply sentences are reduced. So somebody is in prison, their sentence can be commuted. There are remissions, which means that you don't have to pay as much money as you might have accrued in a fine against the United States or to repay your restitution. And then there's just reprieves where you get a delay. So We've seen a lot. You tend to see a lot of those as a president is heading out the door. One, some of these things can be kind of controversial, and they don't want to be around for long as the president to endure some of the criticism that would come. So let's start with Joe Biden. He had every president pardoned some people in the course of their presidency, but in December he kicked off the season, if you will, by pardoning his own son, Hunter Biden.
He did, yeah. So I think that coming into the end of the Biden administration, everybody was wondering how many pardons he would do,
right?
Because there was just talk about if now that Trump is back in the White House and he has control of who's the Attorney General, and he can, he sort of flexed his muscle about his power over the DOJ. Would he go after his perceived political enemies using the Justice Department? And would there need to be any protections? And the first one that he kicked it off with was his own son, Hunter Biden, who had already been, tried and convicted of, I don't know if he was tried, but he was convicted of charges, gun and
tax fraud.
Gun and tax fraud. Well, he was about to go to have another court case in the tax part of it, and he had just been under investigation and been the center of a lot of the Republican lawmaker efforts to bring an investigation into Joe Biden himself and Joe Biden's family and their finances, and so Biden did it. He gave him a pardon, and he basically said, it's my son, and he's been punished enough.
Right. And also preemptively pardoned for him for anything else that may come up too. So in case, there were further investigations, he said it was not just a pardon for what he had done and been convicted of, but what might come up later.
Right.
Pretty comprehensive.
Yes.
And then we saw more commutations, particularly for drug offenses and so forth. This had been on folks' mind. There were a couple of sort of one-offs, people who had come up in pardon conversations for a long time, like Leonard Peltier, who had been in prison for convictions of killing federal law enforcement officers back in the 70s. There's a documentary film I remember about him. It was about the incident called Incident at Ogallala in the 90s. I think that movie came out. Anyway, so those are typical. And then we get to the very end of the Biden presidency on that last day or two, and we see more family members and almost like a class of people who he pardoned. He pardoned his brother, his sister, and then also everyone who was associated with the Select Committee to investigate January 6th. Members of Congress like Liz Cheney, Jamie Raskin, Benny Thompson, members of the staff, and then also anyone who had testified, particularly police officers, Michael Thanone, Metro PD officer who'd come up a lot because he's a very fervent Trump critic, and then also Harry Dunn, who's a Capitol Police officer who went on to run for Congress and was a surrogate for Kamala Harris and was very outspoken. So that, that whole and that was like, oh, they hadn't even been accused of doing anything wrong. Well, Donald Trump had accused them of doing bad things, but there was no crime, involved in this. But there was such concern by the Biden folks, and even some of them asked, like Benny Thompson said, he asked for a preemptive pardon.
Yeah, Trump had previously said that members of the Select Committee should, quote, go to jail.
Right.
So he, there's this floating around, and we've written a story or two about, how Trump's could go after some lawmakers if he wanted to or tried to. So it's been out in the area. And I think the quote from Harry Dunn, who was the former Capitol Police officer that you mentioned, his statement afterwards was, quote, "I wish this pardon weren't necessary, but unfortunately the political climate we are in now has made the need for one somewhat of a reality." So I think that was sort of the sense of why Biden did these kind of pardons.
And Biden also, noted that, and we should also mention Anthony Fauci and General Mark Milley were, also the subject of Trumpian and MAGA ire, were given pardons, even though, again, not accused in any kind of court of law or anything of doing anything wrong.
Right.
And one of the things that Biden said was just the threat of being investigated means you have to get a lawyer, that you have to spend all this time, fighting the charges, even if they're spurious. And so just by, the concern too about people who are in Congress and people who are, in particular like staffs and so forth, is that they are theoretically protected by the speech or debate clause, which means that in the course of your duties, whether it's congressional oversight, like the January 6th committee was doing, you're protected by the Constitution in carrying out your duties in good faith. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't be hauled in front of a committee. You can't be like, somebody could sue you, or like if a enterprising U.S. attorney goes after you, you still have to get a lawyer. People like Dunn he's a cop. He doesn't have, he's not a multimillionaire who can spend a lot of money on lawyers and so forth. So that seems to be like, again, there are many reasons to grant a pardon, but that came up again and again. Like these Biden said, they didn't do anything wrong. They were just doing public service, but just the threat of Trump going after them, necessitated the pardons from his perspective.
Sure, and he got a lot of criticism from Republican lawmakers over it. That they said, well, what is he hiding? What does Fauci need to be pardoned for? And you have Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, Republican, who the incoming chairman of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, who said this isn't going to end our quest to find out more about Fauci and what he knew and when he knew it about the COVID-19. So, there still can be investigations and they still might need to hire lawyers and stuff like that for that. But yeah, the threat of I think this more eases the threat of, will you have to face some sort of criminal investigation?
Right. And then again, a few hours after Trump takes the oath of office, he issues a very broad, set of pardons to anyone who, is associated with the January 6th insurrection, trying to stop the electoral count. And as you and your team have reported on, this was this is almost a different class. We'll talk about like how presidents have used pardons for individuals as well as classes of people. This almost gets into the class action part of it, and I know that that's not the right term from a lawyer's perspective. It's not a class action lawsuit, but it's a broad swath of people from a number of different crimes, including terrorism charges, and amounts to. I'll let you say it.
Amounts to what?
The
Well,
largest criminal investigation
yeah.
in the U.S. has undertaken.
So this is what Trump has said he wanted to do when he got back into office, and he won the election with people knowing that he was going to do this, and he did it. And he said he was going to do it on day one. It's a sweeping proclamation. He commuted the sentences of 14 people who were charged with the most serious crimes, and he said maybe in the future he'll think about the pardons for those people. But then he gave a complete and unconditional pardon of all other convictions related to January 6th. He immediately said everybody should be immediately released from prison. And he also dismissed all pending indictments. So he basically wiped out this effort. And it's, again, Merrick Garland, the former attorney general, he called it one of the largest, most complex, most resource-intensive investigations in our history. It was something like 1,500 people are covered by this proclamation, and it was when a large mob of people entered the Capitol during one of the key processes for the transition of power after Trump's loss.
So this is a big deal. I mean, this is and again, it goes all from people who are convicted of trespassing on public property to people who were assaulting police officers and engaging in conspiracy against the United States.
Correct. There was among the
and convicted, not just indicted, but convicted of these crimes.
Right. Among the 1,500 are like more than 100 who were convicted of assaulting law enforcement officers. And this was sort of a line that some Republicans had drawn. But those first 14 that I talked about, they include some that had been convicted of seditious conspiracy and other felonies. The judges in several of those cases had enhanced their sentences for having committed quote unquote terrorism. One of them was Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers group. He was sentenced,
the guy with the eye patch.
Yeah, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Kelly Meigs, who served as a leader of the Florida chapters of Oath Keepers, who was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Joseph Biggs and Zachary Real, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but they were in 17 and 15 years in prison. There was for Rhodes and Meigs, there was an 8-week trial, 3 days of jury deliberation. The DOJ says that they proved that these two began plotting before January 6th, began plotting to oppose by force the lawful transfer of presidential power. They said that they had organized teams that were prepared to bring ammunition, firearms into DC, that they had been recruiting members, teaching and training paramilitary combat tactics. They had knives, batons, camouflaged uniforms, tactical vests. They brought those to the Capitol grounds, radio equipment. And so that's who got their sentences commuted. The pardons, they include a lot of people that sort of became famous afterwards. The QAnon shaman guy, the guy who put his feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk during the whole thing. And it also includes pending indictments. I just went back and looked at the latest arrests for assaulting police officers, and they were made on January 16th and January 17th.
So just last week.
Yeah. So here's people, a 59-year-old Arkansas man who was arrested for, he was accused of pushing against a police officer, grabbing the police officer's baton. There's a 60-year-old man from Ohio who was just arrested for swinging an axe handle at a Metropolitan Police Department officer's hand as the officer was attempting to pepper spray. It struck the metal barricade like directly in front of the officer. And then a 36-year-old California man who is accused of grabbing a police officer's head and neck and pulling him to the ground. So these are the people that are now covered under that. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, was among the Republicans who said like this shouldn't even be on the table. I believe that J.D. Vance he said that obviously you shouldn't be pardoned if you committed violence on that day. Tom Tillis, a senator from Republican senator from North Carolina, Pam Bondi, the attorney general that Trump has picked, was at her confirmation hearing getting grilled about this, and Tillis sort of responded and said, like, he says it's an unfair and absurd hypothetical here that this would happen. And Pam Bondi was like, we're going to go through these by a case basis. And, that didn't happen. It was broad and sweep.
And so that happened. And then, like, as we're just sort of settling in, then we get word of another, pardon that Trump has issued. And again, what's a little bit of a departure is that there have been some high profile pardons issued at the beginning of presidencies. One of which was of a former president, Gerald Ford. One of his first acts as president, one of his first significant acts, at least, was to pardon Richard Nixon, presumptively, who had not been indicted yet. So, like, it's not unheard of that a president pardons them early in a term, but to this degree is a bit of a departure. And then this latest, which you're going to talk about, this is almost the kind of thing that you see at the end of a term. But, like, regardless, here we are. And what's that one?
Yeah, as a guy named Ross Ulbricht, who is serving life in prison in connection with owning and operating this thing called Silk Road, which was a website that law enforcement spent a lot of time tracking down. It was designed, according to the prosecutors and the government, it was designed to allow users to buy and sell illegal drugs and other unlawful goods. And this was in, like, 2011 to 2013 that was operational. And I just went back and looked at what he was accused of doing, what they proved in trial in the Southern District of New York, that it was the most sophisticated and extensive criminal marketplace on the internet, a sprawling black market bazaar where unlawful goods were traded,
It's right there in the name.
thousands of drug dealers, hundreds of kilograms of illegal drugs. So this is the person that Trump said that he pardoned, and he mentioned the support, some support he got during the campaign, but he also said, quote, the scum that worked to convict him were some of the same lunatics who were involved in the modern day weaponization of government against me. So, that, I guess, is his reason for doing it. But he also called the sentence, quote unquote, ridiculous, the life sentence. So, yeah, he took this action, this on day 2. So
These are big. These are notable pardons, in particular, that history will, a little part of the historical record, which I want to get to now, because it's as much of a sort of shock to the system as both were. Like, what I was struck by is there's almost like sort of a conversation. It's like Biden pardons the January 6th committee, which has been the subject of so much of Trump's ire, and then the next day, Trump, the January 6th committee didn't prosecute. That wasn't their job. They weren't prosecuting the January 6th insurrectionists, but then Trump pardons that whole kind of class of people arrested, convicted, indicted, and so forth. So that's extraordinary, and I think that history will note that. But I just want to bring up some of the other sort of very notable pardons in history. Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson both issued blanket pardons, to Lincoln to people who had engaged in rebellion against the United States, and then Johnson specifically to members of the Confederate Army and armed services, as a way of trying to heal, or move on from the Civil War, and which we still see echoes of it. We saw the Confederate stars and bars in the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So that in its time, we don't have the same. I'd have to check what the podcasters were saying back in 1864.
Yeah, Instagram and Meta were not around.
But the historic record, this didn't go over well with everybody, suffice to say, in the time, even though we have different ways of reacting and a different time frame for processing these things. But some of the ones more recently are kind of fascinating too. Richard Nixon commuted Jimmy Hoffa's sentence. Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters president who had clashed with the likes of Bobby Kennedy in the Justice Department and so forth. He had been serving it was a 13-year sentence, and he'd been served. He was, within like 5 or 6 years into his sentence, and Nixon commuted it. Shortly thereafter, after being released from prison, Hoffa went missing, has never been found. Ford, I mentioned, pardoned Nixon for any crimes related to Watergate. Jimmy Carter, one of his first acts, and this was another big blanket one, was pardoning people who had dodged the draft during the Vietnam War, and which amounted to about 200,000 people. So that's a big that's along the lines of what Lincoln and Johnson were doing in the 1860s. And then we get into like some more specific ones. George H.W. Bush, he pardoned 6 people who were associated with the Iran-Contra affair, of which, was going on in the Reagan presidency when he was vice president. Most notably, Caspar Weinberger, who had been indicted for lying to Congress. And among others, there was a gentleman who was in charge of the CIA's clandestine services at the time of Iran-Contra. So those are big. I mean, Iran-Contra, granted, I'm like a nerd and, I was a political science major, but I watched those hearings, when I was a kid, the Iran-Contra hearings in 1986 and 87. And I was just sort of fascinated by them, like how they went down. And, Bill Clinton, among people that he pardoned, were his half brother Roger, who had gone to prison on drug charges, and then Mark Rich on the very last day of his presidency. This was a financier, someone who was a big donor to Democratic causes. Rich was on the lam, and Clinton pardoned him, to much ire of even some of his supporters. It list goes on a little bit. I mean, but Trump himself, this is his, during his first term, pardoned some people who are in his family, at least related by marriage. Charles Kushner, his son-in-law Jared's father, and his current pick to be ambassador to France, he was pardoned. Paul Manafort, who was his first campaign chairman and had served time in prison for fraud. Steve Bannon, his sort of advisor, Uber advisor, was pardoned for defrauding people who he was collecting money to build the wall, or it wasn't it wasn't what he went to prison for, which was contempt of Congress. But Bannon was pardoned on that. Roger Stone was pardoned. His sort of dirty trickster, and again a figure in the going back to Watergate. So there's like this conversation of these different folks throughout history. But this is something that people have strong feelings about it. It seems like an immense power to invest in one person, even with the checks that they may have, checks that they try to install at something like the Justice Department or the White House counsel's office to make sure that people deserve a pardon. But really, this goes back to like English law and the king's power to commute or pardon people. I mean, it's absolute. I mean, in so many ways. One thing we don't know is whether a president can pardon himself, which Trump has said he can, but as our friends at the Congressional Research Services, this is an untested theory, legal theory.
Like so many things with Donald Trump, yes. But I think what the history that you're talking about there is really interesting, because you think back now to like Lincoln, for example, and we don't know what the contemporary discussion was at the time, or I mean, we probably could read books on it, but sitting here,
books.
I know, but sitting here, we can just say like, as humans in year 2025, we say, oh yeah, it seems like a good idea, like move the country forward and heal and all that, and it's always interesting, like when you're covering the last day of the Supreme Court and you say to a legal expert, what's the biggest case this term? They go, well, we don't really know, because some case that we didn't think was big might be big later, and so like with these pardons, I guess time will tell,
right,
on how people ultimately think about these January 6th pardons or the Biden pardons, and but it's definitely really eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people to be able to see like that a president can just decide who is and who isn't going to be punished for crimes that they were convicted of, right, or not even convicted of yet. They can just sort of say, hey, you don't have to worry about it.
Right. And also what's sort of fascinating too is that when I say it's a comprehensive power, I mean there are, according to Congressional Research Service and scholars and the way people read the Constitution, there are basically three ways that you can change the president's or react, or sort of check the president's pardon power. One is a constitutional amendment, which would alter his powers under Article 2 of the Constitution. Not an easy thing to do.
Probably not.
There's congressional oversight, which, granted that's up to people in different committees and chairs and ranking members and so forth. It could happen. We haven't seen the most robust, intelligent oversight that we may expect for, again, referring back to Iran-Contra, that seemed very oversighty, just yelling at witnesses like we've seen over the last few years, less oversighty. That's a word, right?
It is.
And then impeachment, which the president doesn't have the power to pardon impeachments. He can't exercise that power, much like he can't pardon people for state crimes or civil cases. He has no power to pardon impeachments of himself or others. But those are the three things. And again, every president, going back to George Washington, has exercised this power in one way or another. So it's just part of the gig of being a president.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that Republicans who control the House now are not going to be starting impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump over pardons, considering that they opposed his impeachment over the January 6th attack itself. So this is probably just going to be one of those other discussions for history, just like the other ones you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Todd. And we've got a couple of things. The word of the week or words of the week could easily have been any of those, but I feel like we've done like that with pardons, commutations, remissions, reprieves. So here's another one that maybe somebody would think of, or maybe they saw this, and I just want to shed a little light on it. So the words of the week are the president's room. The president's room is this room that's right, in the Senate, part of the Capitol. It's right, it's near the floor. And it's this sort of ornate, I guess there's a lot of ornateness, right? Anything with Constantine Bramides like paintings and frescoes is going to be ornate. But this is a very like ceremonial type room. People got a peek of it if they watched Trump signing any of the paperwork or executive actions and so forth that he did in the Capitol before he left. This is not the signing that he did in the Capital One Arena, home of the Washington Wizards and Washington Capitals, or in the Oval Office. But this is this room that is set aside in the Capitol. It was initially thought of that back when there was this long interregnum between an election in November and when the president took office in March, that the president could just sort of camp out and sign legislation there, in the 19th century and so forth and on. It became a little bit more ceremonial because presidents can sign things wherever they're at now, and they can, do auto pens and so forth. They can even sign things on Air Force One. So but it's still used for things like the inauguration. So if people saw the photos or footage of Trump signing things, handing pens to congressional leaders, that's the Senate room. And before we sign off, I wanted to a tip of the hat, a little bit of a goodbye to David Lynch, the filmmaker. I tried to figure out a way that we could do some sort of political theater aspect to David Lynch's work, but not an overly political person. I guess if somebody in Twin Peaks had been pardoned, or FBI Director Gordon Cole, who Lynch played, had been involved, maybe so, but that, alas, was not part of the Twin Peaks universe. So we'll just do it with what I think is something that Lynch's, one of the gifts that he gave us, which was his daily weather report from Los Angeles. And I won't be able to fully imitate him and his way of doing it, but I'll give it a go, which is, hello, it's Wednesday, January 22nd in Washington, D.C. It's sunny with blue skies, 15 degrees, and we'll get all the way up to 23 today, which is, I don't know the Celsius, but it's below. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.